Hello, my name is Uriel Abramov. I would like to share with you today what brought me to begin learning Kabbalah. I'll tell you a bit about myself. Ever since I'm a little boy, my parents had a very strong connection with the great sage Maran Gaon Harav Eliashiv, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. May he be blessed. He was in those days less difficult to approach, or less people that would come every day to him. But my parents had a very special connection with him. My mother sat down and compared between all the different books in the subject of Jewish family life, and realized there's many differences between the different pamphlets and books, that small differences that make a big difference. So she decided she's going to go to Rabbi Yashiv. She was teaching about Jewish family life. She decided to go to him and show him all the differences, all written out on big pieces of paper, and see what's the way to teach. Should you teach this way or this way? So she went to him with big lists of papers, and I, as a little boy, came and sat on the floor next to his feet, while my mother sat down on a chair and with long lists, and she was going through question after question, asking him, is it better to teach this way or this way? How should it be, like this or like this? And he answered patiently every question. I recall noticing that he always had very, very black shoes, very shiny shoes, and I never understood how his shoes are so shiny. He used to walk very fast, and the roads next to his home, from his home to the yeshiva, the shul where he prayed and learnt, the road was dusty, and I could never figure out how his shoes were always so perfectly shiny, until one day I read a story that his wife, the Rebbitzin, I remember her, Zichrona Livracha, she took upon herself that every day as he walked into the house, she would shine his shoes for him. So he always had perfectly shiny black shoes. And when she died, his daughter took this job upon herself, and she was always in the home, and she used to always shine his shoes every time he walked in. So that solved the mystery of how his shoes were always so black. But in those days, I remember thinking to myself that my biggest wish is to be one day as great as Harav Eliashiv. That was the greatest wish I could imagine. Later on, my mother used to tell us stories every Shabbat afternoon after the meal about Gdolei Israel, about great sages, and she would read us from the stories of Olameinu. It's a set of books in English, all different stories from different writers. I recall one story that made a very strong impression on me, a story about a certain man that was very mysterious. No one knew that he's anything special. He looked like a very simple man. And after some people decided to check out on him and follow him, they discovered that he's a very, very special person. And they found that he was hiding the holy books of Leshem Shvo Ve'Achlama, the holy books in Kabbalah. So I remember wishing to myself, I wish I would learn those books one day. And that was the first time I heard about the books Leshem Shvo Ve'Achlama. Those books were written by Rabbi Yashiv's grandfather, his mother's father. So that was probably the first time I wanted to know more about the Leshem. When I was 11 years old, we came back after a few years of shlichut in Chutz La'aretz, in South Africa. My parents were teaching Torah. And I came back I learned back to the Cheder I was learning beforehand in Yerushalayim, the school for learning Torah. And my grandfather passed away when I was 12 years old. I remember feeling very lonely and feeling a big gap. I felt I'm missing something very, very, very warm in my life. My mother's father. So I would go every time in the break in yeshiva. I went to Yeshiva Ktana, Uriel in Jerusalem. Every time in the break, I would go out in the lunch break to a little quiet shul synagogue in the area, and I would sit there all by myself in the synagogue and page through different books while I ate my lunch. And there were many books of Kabbalah in that shul. I had a tremendous desire to understand what these books, what Kabbalah is about, what is Kabbalah. And I remember paging through the books and not understanding anything, but I felt so special just touching these books and turning the pages, and I would examine book after book and wishing I would one day be able to learn it myself. This very likely came from a very strong curiosity I have by nature, but especially for mystical, the mystical part of Torah, the deep inside of the Torah, the Kabbalah. In this period of time, when I was in Yeshiva Ktana, I remember before the summer period, there was a great rabbi, one of the old remnants of the Musar movement, Rav Chaim Zaitchik, is coming to speak. I was very excited about it, and I sat down right in the front. I listened to every word. All the other boys were 13 years old, already after bar mitzvah. I started young. I was 12 years old, and he spoke all about Musar and the importance of learning well and growing up to become great sages, Talmidei Chachamim. And when he ended, he said, "One day when you will get married, I'll come to the wedding." He felt closeness. Later on, I discovered that he didn't have any children of his own. So he felt a closeness to these teenage boys, and he said, he wished he'll come to our wedding. He was an old man of 90. So I thought to myself, what's the difference between a wedding or bar mitzvah? I'll have him come to my bar mitzvah. So I wrote on the invitation to my bar mitzvah a few words. I enjoyed the rabbi's shiur in our yeshiva, Uriel Chanan, and I would like to invite the Rav to my bar mitzvah. I put the invitation in his post box. I thought nothing would ever come out of this, but I tried. A week after the bar mitzvah, a boy comes to call me and says to me, "Rav Chaim Zaitchik is calling you to his home to speak to you." I was very nervous. I came to his home, I knocked on the door, and a very warm person opens the door, an old man, and he says to me, "I'm so sorry I couldn't come to your bar mitzvah." He told me what bar mitzvah is all about, how great it is the day a person becomes bar mitzvah. And he gave me a present, 3 of his books that he wrote. He wrote like 23 books in Musar, all about ethics, Jewish ethics. So he gave me 3 of his books a present. He wrote Mazal Tov, and I was very excited. But then he says to me, "How about the book on the biography of Gdolei Israel, of the great sages? Do you have that book?" I said, "No." It's called HaMeorot HaGdolim. This is like a diary that he wrote firsthand, things he witnessed from the great Musar students, the Saba ben Novardok, who he learned by, Sami Kelem, Sami Slabotka, Rabbi Israel Salanta, the rabbi, and the Chafetz Chaim was very big into Musar, Jewish ethics, and many others. So he gave me the book as well, and he told me within a year he wants me to learn through the whole book and, try following in the footsteps. I saw he was so warm. I asked him, could I come every day to speak to the rabbi? I found a new grandfather. He said yes. So every day in lunchtime I had what to do. I came over to him for about 20 minutes. I would speak to him, and he would offer me some food he had left over from lunch, and he would kiss me. He felt real closeness to me, and he would tell me all about his life when he was a yeshiva student in Novardok in Europe, and what a difficult life he had, how nowadays it's so easy to be a yeshiva student, and what it meant in those days. Later on, a few boys asked me if they can join me, and I turned into an official Vad, which is a small group in his house. We would come like once a week for an hour, and he would teach us. One thing that he said over these 3 years that I learned by him until he died, one thing he said made a very big impression on me. He told me once, when you have sheifot, you wish to be great, you wish to become one day a great man, never ever look at the greatest boy in your yeshiva and think to yourself, I want to be like him. Because one day you'll grow and you'll feel, now I am the way he was then. And then you'll stop growing because you'll relax. You'll feel, I got to the height of my sheifot, the height of my dreams. So he says what you should do is you must take always a rabbi from the previous generation, that you'll never be as great as him, and wish, I want to be like a rabbi in the previous generation. Then hopefully one day, if you work very hard, maybe you'll be like half of what he was. You'll be like a great rabbi in your generation, because we know that there's a tremendous Yeridat Dorot. Every generation goes less and less. This doesn't mean that there's any part of Torah that's missing. I heard once from Rav Volbe that there's no part of the Torah that is missing in our days. The Torah was passed down from Moses on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, from generation to generation, complete. The full Torah, the written Torah, and the oral Torah. The difference is that in every generation, the format became smaller. Nowadays, one can print on a small card a whole book. Is there anything missing? If you look at the card, you just see dots. You don't see anything special. But there's nothing missing on the book. It's just, you take a machine, you put this card into the machine, and you see it's all there. Every dot is like one page. Same thing in the Torah. Nowadays, there's nothing missing from the Torah. It's all there. Torah Hashem Tmima is complete. Meshivat Nafesh. It satisfies a person and brings him to life. There's nothing missing in the Torah. But the Torah, the format goes smaller and smaller as generations go by. So hopefully, with this way, I'll be able to become the greatest or great rabbi in our times. I remember at the time when he told me this, I thought to myself, who is my image in life from the previous generation? I want to be like the Chafetz Chaim, the famous great sage, the Chafetz Chaim. From all the reasons in the world. He was great in halacha. He wrote the Mishnah Berurah. He was great in midot, many books about good character traits. He was very great in Be'adam Lachavero, in being nice to other people. He got a tremendous influence from Rabbi Uriel Salanta, the founder of the Musar movement of 150 years ago. So I thought to myself, I want to be like the Chafetz Chaim. And this, I continued thinking this throughout quite a few years. Later on, I went to learn in Yeshiva Gdola in Jerusalem, Yeshivat Kol Torah, by the great Rabbi Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was a good friend of Rabbi Yashiv. And I was very excited that after a few years of learning in the yeshiva, I was zocher to learn in his shiurim of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And this is the last year that he gave shiurim. The year after me, already he said he doesn't have any more strength to give shiurim. He was old. He stopped giving shiurim. So I was lucky to catch the last year of shiurim from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And then when my parents went for a few years to teach Torah in America, I went with them for a year to learn in Yeshiva Gdola in Passaic, New Jersey, by Rameir Stern. And then I came back to Eretz Israel. But before I came back, I got a blessing from a great rabbi in America, Rav Mordechai Menachem Schwab, who was the Rav of Monsey after Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky passed away. And he was the mashgiach in the yeshiva where I learned in America, in Passaic, New Jersey. So he gave a very interesting blessing. He said the verse, Urei betuv Yerushalayim kol yemei chayecha. You should see in the good of Jerusalem all your life. Now, I never had the merit of living in Jerusalem. I live in Kiryat Sefer, Modi'in Illit, which is like an hour drive from Jerusalem. But years later, I realized what he meant in his blessing, how the blessing came true. I hope it will continue coming true. I'll get to that later. After learning in Passaic, I came back to Jerusalem. I went to learn out of town in Yeshivat Be'er Yaakov. Be'er Yaakov, about an hour drive from Jerusalem. The great sage Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. He was the head of the yeshiva, and after a while I was learning in the yeshiva. I had the great merit of learning in his own shiurim, in his daily shiurim. That was very exciting, and I enjoyed his way of learning. He did iyun, he learned to the depth, but not too much pilpul. He learned to the depth, but iyun kal, similar to the style of brisk. After learning in Be'er Yaakov, I got married. But there's a very important incident I want to mention about the period I learned in Be'er Yaakov. Every Shabbat afternoon, Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira would give a short lecture, and then he would sing songs he composed. First he would speak in halacha, and then he would continue speaking in Agadah, which is about ethics of the Torah, strengthening the boys. I recall one week that he came and said, this week, one of the great sages gave a speech against the regular way of learning of the Ashkenazi yeshivot. He complained that the yeshivot are learning too much in the style of pilpul, going too much to the depth and not covering enough ground, not going enough into halacha, what comes out practically from the learning too much in theory, academically, discussing the text without bringing it to actuality. He complained that the Ashkenazi yeshivot are studying Rav Shimon Shkop, Rav Tori Trop, Rav Elchanan Wasserman, the great late Rashi Yeshivot, heads of Yeshivot, just before the Holocaust, and not enough learning the Poskim, the Rif, the Rosh, the Rambam, to bring the Gemara, to bring the Talmud Bavli into Halacha, into practically to see how to practically follow what we're learning. So he brought a very interesting parable. There was once two men that were asked to go through a big, large room, and on the other side of the room, there's another room they have to get to. So they have to go through the room and get to the door to reach the other room. The other room is a room full of light, very special room, but they first have to go through this great, large room on the way. The first person, they let him go through the room, but the lights were off in the first room. So the person had to walk through the room, feel the walls, crash into different objects. He kept stumbling over things. It was crawling part of the way. He hurt himself. Eventually, after many hours of going through this large room, he managed to figure out where the door is to the other room, and he got into the other room. The second person They opened the light and told him, go through the room. He went right through the room, and within a minute, he was in the other room, opened the door, he saw exactly where the door is, he opened the door, and he got to the light, the great lighted up room on the other side. Which person got to the light first? The first person or the second person? Obviously, the second person. He went straight to the light. But if we're going to examine which person knows what's going on in the first room, the second person would say, I didn't notice. I just walked straight through the first room to get to the other room. I have no idea what was in the first room. But the first person, he knows, he learned in a difficult way. He knows exactly what there is in the first room. He knows, be careful, here there's something sticking out of the wall you can crash into, and there's something, a stumbling block in the middle of the way. He knows exactly what there is, what each thing feels like. He learned on his skin, on his flesh, exactly what there is in the first room. He can describe everything in the first room, even though it was pitch black. Eventually, he also reached the second room with the light. Who will appreciate the light more, the first one or the second one? Obviously, the first one will appreciate the light much more because he worked much harder till he got to the light. The same thing is two different ways of learning Talmud Bavli, learning Gemara. The one way is the way of Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud we have from was made in Jerusalem by the early Amoraim of 1,800 years ago. They learned the Gemara passed down from Mount Sinai with no trouble at all. They just sat down and worked out what the Gemara says, came straight conclusions, halakha, what halakha comes out of all the Torah Shebaal Peh, and they got straight to the light. But the Talmud Bavli, which was after the Talmud Yerushalmi, these Amoraim, they went in a totally different way. They went in the dark. They were figuring out each thing they learned, examining each thing. Why does it have to be this way? Why can't it be different? What's the exact hagdara? How do we describe every single thing we learned? What does it mean? To understand all the way to the depth. They worked very hard. But after all the work, they eventually reached the light, and the halakha, when they reached the light, the halakha shone much stronger. The verse says, the Midrash brings the verse, Ha'olchim b'choshech ra'u or gadol. And the Midrash explains, Ze Talmud Bavli. The verse said, those that went in the dark saw eventually a great light. Those are the sages of the Babylonian Talmud, because they learned the difficult way. They had to first understand each thing. Why does it have to be the way it is? Why can't it be different? Why can't you think in a different way? Until they realized that's the only correct and logical way of learning. And then they got to the halakha. They have the halakha much clearer. They know exactly all the hagdarot, how to describe the halakha. Said Rabbi Shmuel Shapira, Marosh Shiva, the Ashkenazi yeshivot learned in the way of Talmud Bavli. They go in the dark. They really are deep into pilpul and working hard and figuring out, and they're going in the dark. But eventually, the light that they'll get to when they get to the halakha will be much stronger. The halakha, they'll not just be able to answer questions in halakha, which is what things they learned. They'll be able to also answer questions about things they didn't learn, because they know exactly what the hagdarot are, where each thing comes from, what each thing means, and then they really understand the build-up of the halakha. So I just think that this is all true if eventually the Ashkenazi yeshivot reach the halakha eventually. Some only reach it after they get married, hopefully. But at least then they should reach the halakha. But if they never reach the halakha, there really is a reason to complain if they're just dealing with the pilpul all their life and they never ever get eventually to the halakha. They must at some point also get to the or gadol. But the general way, that is the general way of the Ashkenazi yeshivot, of learning in the way of going in the dark. It's difficult, it's heavy, but it's worth it. The light you get to in the end is much more shinier and gives a tremendous satisfaction. I remember in that same talk of Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira, he sang a song. I'm not sure if he composed it or it's an older song. The song goes 2 words. Amar Abaye, one of those that speak the most in Talmud, is called Abaye. Amar Abaye, Abaye said, and the song goes like this. It begins with a bit of a regular, jolly beginning. It goes on, it gets sadder and sadder until it gets to like almost despair. And eventually it starts getting happier again, happier, even happier. Eventually it gets really happy. That's how the build-up of this tune is. I'll sing you the tune. Omar Abaye, 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 Omar Abaye. This tune, he said, shows exactly how it works when you learn Gemara, when you learn Talmud Bavli. It starts off, okay, things seem simple and seem very straightforward when you just begin. But as you start going into the sugya, into the depth of the learning, you realize there's questions, there's contradictions, there's things that are misunderstood, there's sfekot, there's doubts, there's contradictions from different places and contradictions of the same speaker in the place. There's many questions until a person reaches a stage that he feels like in a total darkness. He's almost about to get to despair. But then after he works very hard and doesn't give up, he starts seeing the light in the edge of the tunnel and things start getting happier and happier until he's beaming with happiness. That's what learning Talmud Bavli is like. This talk made a big impression on me. After the talk, I went over to the Maran HaGaon HaGadol, Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira, and I asked him a question. I asked him, was this the way of learning of the Chafetz Chaim? My image in life was the Chafetz Chaim. Was this the way of learning of the Chafetz Chaim? I knew the answer would be no. And he said, no, don't bring a proof from the Chafetz Chaim. He was different. He was an exception. Because he had to write the great historical work of the Mishnah Brura, the biggest halachic work of the latest generations. It took him 28 years to write this set of halacha, Mishnah Brura, which is the great explanation on the Shulchan Aruch, how exactly one should act in everyday life. So don't bring a proof from him. He is different. He's the exception. I thought to myself when he said to me that, very nice. He's an exception. I also want to be an exception. I also want to learn in the way of the Chafetz Chaim. He is my image in life. And I also prefer to less work on the pilpul and more work on the halacha. Although I want to take heed from the story, and I don't want to go straight to the halacha. I definitely want to work on the Talmud Bavli and go in the dark first, but not too much in the dark. I want to, at some point, get to the light of the halacha. That was what I thought when I was a yeshiva student learning by Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapira. After I got married, I went to live in Kiryat Sefer, learning in Korelim for the last 20 years. Korelim is like a yeshiva for married men. Besides a bit of teaching at night, but full day learning. And I recall that I decided I want to keep Tvilat Ezra. The Talmud says that Ezra, who was one of in the time of the end of the prophets, thousands of years ago, Ezra Sofer made a takana that from his time and onwards, any person that has relations with his wife, personal relations, he should go to the mikveh and then learn Torah or pray. The Talmud Bavli says that in the later generations, this was not accepted because any takana, any decision of the great sages that at the time the sages saw that most of Am Yisrael could not stand up to it, was too difficult for them to keep, they cancelled it. So this takana was cancelled. There's no chiyuv, there's no obligation nowadays to, before learning Torah, for a man to go to the mikveh, to go immerse in the waters of the mikveh. Not for learning Torah and not for praying. But nevertheless, the great rabbis say that it's a very great thing whoever can do it. So I thought I would like to do that. In fact, I read that the Stipler, who was one of the great rabbis from previous generation, the Stipler said that all those rabbis that their books were accepted widely in Am Yisrael are those rabbis that were careful to keep Takanat Ezra. They were makpid, they were absolutely careful to go to the mikveh after personal relations with one's wife. This takana, the Rambam, the Maimonides, one of the great sages of 800 years ago, one of the great poskim of halakha, says that he himself never missed it out. Even though there's no obligation, but it's very good to do it, and he never missed it out. He writes, whoever's careful to do this will live a long life. So it's something definitely worthwhile doing. And nowadays it's so easy. In every corner there's another mikveh for men open during the day. There's no problem. Very cheap, very easy. So I thought to myself, I would like to do that. But I came from a family that is very, very unacceptable. My father and my father-in-law, their minhag from home, their custom from home, was to go to the mikveh for men only once a year. Erev Yom Kippur, day before Yom Kippur, then everyone goes to the mikveh. But the rest of the year, no, they never go to the mikveh. Nowadays, the father goes every Friday, every Erev Shabbat. But in those days, they would only go once a year. So I was embarrassed for my wife to go out to the mikveh. I recall hiding the towel under my jacket and sneaking out of the house to go on the way to the prayers to go to the mikveh. And every time I was caught. My wife has a tremendous wisdom never to miss out. She always caught me. She would either say, what's sticking out over here? Or what's sticking out here from the back? Is that a towel? Are you trying to sneak to the mikveh? You're trying to be more religious than your father and father-in-law? What is this about? Just stick to the rules. Don't try and be better than everyone else. But I really wanted to do it. So I would continue trying over and over again to sneak out to the mikveh. Thinking back, years later, I gave up already on sneaking. I just said straight out. Everyone got used to the idea. I just said straight out, my custom is, yes, to go. I go and finished. I would just walk out with my bag, with a towel, without any embarrassment. I was thinking nowadays, who knows, maybe the reason, the merit that I got to learn Kabbalah was this merit of taking upon myself, bli neder, without a neder, of course, take it upon ourselves to do this Tfilat Ezra. Because we see that this is connected to Kabbalah. We find that there was a false Messiah 300 years ago called Shabtai Tzvi. He caused tremendous harm in Am Yisrael. He claimed his Messiah. He studied a lot of Kabbalah, and rabbis believed him that he's a Messiah, until eventually he was caught by the Muslim king, and he gave him the choice either to become Muslim or to get killed, and he in public, unfortunately, became Muslim. And then the rabbis realized that he was a false Messiah. Everyone realized. There were some rabbis that realized even earlier, but then everyone realized that he was a false Messiah, besides a few followers that when they completely left the way of Judaism and went into some kind of strange way of Shabtaut, which is following Shabtai Tzvi, something in between Judaism and Islam. That caused tremendous amount of harm to the Jewish people, this Shabtai Tzvi. In fact, we are suffering from this one man, Shabtai Tzvi, to this day. Because 100 years later came a man called Yaakov Frank. He claimed he is the new coming of Shabtai Tzvi, and he had some followers that believed him. And he started a new cult called Frankistim, which they completely left the ways of Torah. In fact, they caused the burning in public of the Talmud Bavli, and they caused tremendous amount of harm to the Jewish people. They behaved in a terrible way. Eventually, Yaakov Frank himself publicly became a Christian, and then everyone realized that he's completely off the way. But from the remains of these Jews that became Shabtaim and Frankistim, all of a sudden there was Jews that the whole emunah, the whole belief, has been weakened. In those days came along two men, one man called Geiger and another man called Mendelssohn. Geiger started the Reform movement. Mendelssohn started the Enlightenment movement. Both these movements caused tremendous harm to the Jewish religion. They started the Reforms and the Maskilim, and many of their disciples and grandchildren became Christians and left completely Judaism. So up until Shabtai Tzvi, all the Jews in the world, up until 300 years ago, all the Jews in the world were keeping Torah mitzvot 100%. There were always some Jews that didn't know much. They were not learned. But whatever they knew, they kept. There was no such thing as people that didn't believe, didn't follow the Jewish way. Everyone followed the Jewish way. Shabtai Tzvi caused all of a sudden to a new situation. Now, a few hundred years later, there's Shabtaim, there's Frankistim, there's Reform, there's similar to Reform was conservative, there's the Enlightenment, Maskilim, and then for the remains of the Maskilim started a new movement by Herzl called Zionism, which persuaded many Jews that, it's enough to just go to Israel and you don't have to keep Torah mitzvot. So actually, the cause of most of the Jewish people nowadays, unfortunately, not keeping Torah and commandment and 613 mitzvot is this one man, Shabtai Tzvi. So the great rabbi, the Maor Bashemesh, one of the early Hasidic rabbis, asked what caused Shabtai Tzvi to go off the Jewish way. He was such a great learner. He was deep in Kabbalah. In fact, I once read about him that he would cry so much about the destruction of the temple that every day he would fill up a cup full of tears and he would drink the cup to mourn for the destruction of the temple. So he was a real serious Kabbalah learner. So what caused him to go so crooked? He said to the Ma'or Shemesh that he and his followers and his people learned Kabbalah without purity of the body. A very important condition in learning Kabbalah is there must be purity of the body. Person must, whenever he's impure, if he was with his wife, he must go to do Tevilat Ezra. Even though there's no obligation in general to do it, but for people that are learning Kabbalah, it's an obligation. Otherwise, it could cause problems like Shabtai Tzvi caused. But we shouldn't take this too far, because the great old Kabbalist of our times, after Rav Kaduri passed away, the greatest Kabbalist today is called Rav Shraya de Beletsky from Bnei Brak. He said that this is only speaking about learning Kabbalah permanently, always learning Kabbalah without purity of the body. But a person that one day isn't pure, temporary, wants to learn Kabbalah, there's no problem whatsoever. A person doesn't have to refrain from learning Kabbalah because it's not pure. But I thought to myself, who knows, maybe this merit is the merit that I started learning Kabbalah. After I got married, I used my curiosity in a very interesting way. I started finding out where am I coming from, who's my family, and I went deep into the heritage of the family in my spare time, and I made a family tree going many generations back. I thought that this could help out in keeping certain halachot. Let's say there is a Khatam Sofer, one of the great rabbis of 150 years ago, that says that until Revi'i, which is until the third cousins 3 times removed, are called relatives. So it's important to know who they are in order to do chesed. Anytime a person is doing charity or chesed, one should first do chesed with his relatives, and then they are prior to doing chesed with others. So if 2 poor people come to me, the one is a relative of mine and the one is a stranger, I definitely should give first to my relative. So the Khatam Sofer says relatives are called until Revi'i. So I thought, very important, I must know who they are. But later on, I completely stopped working on this because I heard the Psak Halacha of the rabbi I follow, Maran Rav Eliashiv Zetzal, that he said that relatives for Kedima, for tzedakah, for charity, relatives are only those that are psulim le'edut. Only the first cousins are the furthest relatives. The grandparents' brothers and sisters, but not further than that. Second cousins are not called relatives. So I thought to myself, what a waste of time. I shelved this whole project, and I thought I'll use my curiosity in a different direction completely. I went into a new project. I started working on the Tariag mitzvot, figuring out exactly what are the 613 mitzvot according to all the different opinions, which verses they are learned out from, how exactly, what the details are, and which ones apply nowadays, which ones not. I found it very, very interesting understanding this whole setup of how the 613 mitzvot work. And I came out with the whole manuscript of a book I wanted to print. I gave it into the famous printers Feldheim a few years ago, and then all of a sudden there was a collapse in Feldheim. They went bankrupt. The whole Feldheim collapsed. Later on, they were revived again, but they had new partners. But that was the end of my printing my book. So at that point, I actually stopped working on that subject. But my curiosity was not quenched. My thirst remained. When did my thirst really come to satisfaction? When I started learning Kabbalah. That was what I was really thirsty for. When I started when I was age 12, just turning pages without understanding anything, when I started learning Kabbalah, I realized this is what I was all my life looking for. This is what I was looking for. Let's get there. As I told you, I had this blessing of the great Rav Mordechai Menachem Schwab, Uriel b'tuv Yerushalayim kol yemei chayecha. I should see in the goodness of Jerusalem all my life. About 10 years after getting married, I started learning in koilelim, in learning places for married men of Torah in Jerusalem. And I learned in very, very, very great places by very great rabbis. First, I learned a few years by the famous Rav Moshe Shapira, who is a deep thinker in Machshava, in Kabbalah. He is not well today. He should have a refuah shlema soon. Then I learned a few years. When I was learning by Rav Moshe Shapira, I had an opportunity to finally page through these books of the Leshem, my dream, Rav Eliashiv's grandfather, these books that I heard about ever since I was a young child. They had the books there, and I was paging through them, but I could not understand anything of Kabbalah. I just paged through the books, and I saw there's many parts of which are not Kabbalah in the books that are very, very sweet and very special. He has such a sweetness about his way of speech. He actually feeds a person with a spoon to the mouth. He explains everything so beautifully. Would just sit down and read Leshem, especially in the part, there's 4 volumes to the Leshem. There's Akdamot V'Sharim, there's Hade'ah, Sefer HaBiurim, and Sefer HaKlalim. The main book I would read in those days was Sefer HaDe'ah Chelek Bet, volume 2, which many parts of it is all about the stories of the Talmud and the depth of Kabbalah behind them, and Agadah stories and very amazing explanations to Psukim. I just found tremendous pleasure learning these books of the Leshem. But I didn't start learning the actual Kabbalah. Rav Moshe Shapira in his shurim was not teaching Kabbalah. He was teaching machshava, deep machshava, with a bit of a lick of musagim, of terms taken from the Kabbalah, but not the real thing. I was still thirsty for the real thing, for the real Kabbalah. Then I went to learn in a great Rabbi, Rav Agaon Gadol, Rav Osher Weiss, that he was teaching Choshen Mishpat, the parts of Torah about monetary, halachic parts of Torah, that learning this actually brings a person to be able to become a judge, a dayan. But after a few years of learning by him, I still had this thirst. I want to learn Kabbalah. So I kept paging through. One could download from the computer all the books of the Leshem Shvo V'Achlama in the site of Hebrew books, or in Otzara Chochmah. They have it. So I would still look through these books of the Leshem over there in my spare time. An interesting thing happened just before I finished learning by Rabbi Osher Weiss. Was my mother, who, as I said, my parents are very great lecturers and teachers in Jewish family life. They have the organization of Jewish marriage education. They've taught thousands of teachers around the world. So they wrote 5 best-selling books. The last book they were about to write was the book, The Unique Princess. I have a copy of it here in Hebrew, The Unique Princess. This book speaks about the modesty of the Jewish lady, according to Torah. But it's done in such a beautiful way. It's done in a way of only positive, nothing negative, only speaking about how great and how wonderful it is, without telling what punishments or terrible things if one doesn't keep these laws. It's only speaking positive from beginning to end, and in such a beautiful manner with stories and beautiful mekorot, verses and sayings from the Talmud. So just before my mother wanted to bring out this book, she asked me if I could help her with the sources for the book, to check through it and add sources and perhaps maybe see if there's any things that not worth bringing down, or check if there's any sources not accurate. So I took this as a real project. I really worked in it, and for a few weeks I read through twice the full manuscript of the book before it was printed, and the book came out beautifully. Another thing I contributed to the book was this book had many Ashkenazic haskamot, many Ashkenazi rabbis that write how great this book is. But I wanted to add a great Sephardic rabbi. So Sephardi Jews will also be able to use this book and enjoy it. So I had connections how to get to Rav Hagaon HaGadol, Rav Ovadia Yosef, and I had him check through the entire book. He checked through the entire book, and he came out. First, he gave it to his student to check, and the student came out with a whole pamphlet of differences of opinion between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim in the laws of modesty for the lady. But when he showed this to Rav Ovadia Yosef said it's not true, it's very subtle differences, it doesn't make a difference, it's not called differences. He said the only two differences are two small differences, that those differences is printing in the beginning of the book, printed just after his askama, after his words of praise to the book, are two differences, subtle differences between the Ashkenazim and Sephardim. All the rest are acceptable by him 100%. So what I accomplished is that my parents' great book on modesty actually now is not only for the Ashkenazic Jews, it's good for anyone. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, they all can follow the same book and get the great benefits of this book. I thought to myself, who knows if the reason how so soon after I worked so hard on this book, I helped my parents with this book, so soon after, all of a sudden, I got to start learning Kabbalah, which I thought to myself, I was always scared of learning Kabbalah. I was nervous. What will people say? How could I? What will happen to me if I learn Kabbalah? Who knows how scary it is? There's so many stigmas, so many myths about learning Kabbalah that are so widespread. Every person has a different myth about Kabbalah, that many of them are so not true. So how did it come about? Very soon after I finished working on this book, I think it was the same week I finished working on this book, all of a sudden, my father says to me, you are working on Leshem. Why don't you go and speak to a real expert in Leshem? A real expert in learning Leshem, one of the greatest old Kabbalists in Jerusalem, Rav Moshe Schatz from Givat Shaul in Jerusalem. His students today are already great Kabbalists themselves. One of the great Kabbalists today that is great in the deep Kabbalah book of Torah Chacham, Rav Yitzchak Meir Morgenstern, is his student. So I went to his house. He knows my father. And I spoke to him and I asked him, I'm 39 years old. I really would like to learn Kabbalah. I tasted Leshem, but I never dared tasting the Kabbalistic parts of the Leshem. Could I start trying to learn also the Kabbalistic parts of Leshem? Or do I have to only stick to the Nigleh, to the parts that are not Kabbalah? He said, yes, you can. I can start learning Kabbalah. I wasn't even 40 years old. Later on, I discovered this whole thing of 40 years old is not so accurate. Everyone thinks that you can't learn Kabbalah before you're 40 years old. This is said by the Shach in the Shulchan Aruch, Yesh Omrim. He says, some say not to start learning Kabbalah before age 40. Only some say. Many halachic rabbis said different. Rav Meir Papirash, one of the great sages of a few hundred years ago, said one could learn Kabbalah from age 20 and married. Once he's married. The Rav Daniel Frisch, who made the translation to the Zohar HaKadosh, Matok Bidvash, says that the Khatam Sofer in Parashat Shmot, the great Rabbi Khatam Sofer of 150 years ago, says in Shmot, Parashat Shmot, that also from age 20 and married. I never found it. I would like to find exactly where this Khatam Sofer is. Could be there's a few versions of Khatam Sofer Parashat Shmot. And besides that, we have the greatest Kabbalist before the Uriel Kadosh, the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, also writes clearly, I saw in the book Ornei Rav, that one's allowed to start learning Kabbalah from age 20 once he's married. And finally, the greatest weighing halachic rabbi, that one of the famous halachic poskim of the last generation, the Kaf HaChaim, Rav Yaakov Chaim Sofer, he writes in Siman Kuf Nun Vav, in Orach Chaim, as far as I remember, he writes, from age 20 and married, one is allowed to halachically start learning Kabbalah. So that story of 40 years old is not accepted halachically by the poskim of our generation. I came home from Rav Moshe Schatz very excited. Wow, he gave me permission to start learning Kabbalah, finally. So I sat down, opened the Leshem, and started trying to read and understand in the regular parts of the Kabbalah of the Leshem. And I could not understand anything, nothing. I thought I would understand things because I learned 3 years by Rav Moshe Shapira. I got a few words of what they mean. I heard about Eser Sfirot. But it didn't help me anything. I could not understand anything. So I was upset. I thought finally I'm starting to learn Kabbalah, and it seems further than ever. How will I ever get to learning Kabbalah? But Hashem had mercy on me, and that's b'derech sh'adam rotzeh lelech molichin oto. When a person really wants something, Hashem helps him. That same week, my father said to me, a new kollel opened up, a great existing kollel in Jerusalem of about 300 students, is opening a new group. This kollel is mainly for halakha, for Talmud. They learn for becoming great rabbis. They have all different groups of different parts of halakha, Shabbat, Kashrut, Jewish marriage. But they're opening a new group for the first time of Kabbalah for beginners. And the leader of the group is going to be the great Kabbalist, one of the greatest Kabbalists of our times. HaGaon HaMekubal, Rav Reuven Sofer, Sheyichyeh L'chaim Tovim Arukim, may he live many, many years. My Rabbi, Rav Sofer, he is a great-grandson of the Kaf HaChaim, Rav Yaakov Chaim Sofer, who was also a very great rabbi in halakha and also a very great Kabbalist. So this Rav Sofer, I said, yes, I'm joining the kollel, I'm joining this learning institution. And I still had cold feet. When I spoke to the head of the kollel on the phone, I told him, who said it's okay? Maybe I'm not allowed to, I'm too young maybe. Who said I'm worthy of learning Kabbalah? So he persuaded me like 40 minutes on the phone that yes, I should not be so worried about it. I can do it. It's for me. Go ahead. You really want, and those that really want will succeed. It's for you. So I came into the kollel, and I left the kollel of Rav Osher Weiss. I came into this kollel, and within a few weeks of learning Barav Sofer, very intensely, every day, an hour and a half lecture, shiur on Kabbalah. He taught us from the beginning of the Sefer Otzrot Chaim of the Uriel Kadosh, the greatest Kabbalist of 450 years ago. In the actual book of the Uriel Kadosh, Otzrot Chaim, he taught us the book from beginning to end, and within a few weeks, I suddenly realized I know so many musagim, so many terms in Kabbalah that I could start trying to learn Leshem. In those first few weeks, I wasn't embarrassed at all. Lo abaishan lamed. A person that's embarrassed will never learn. So even though many of the guys there are much older than me, and most of them are Sephardic, they are born Kabbalists. Sephardic, in their prayer book, there's all about things based on Kabbalah. They're much more involved in Kabbalah. The halakha usually has many, many more parts of Kabbalah that come from the Kabbalah. But nevertheless, I wasn't embarrassed, and I sat quite close to Rav Sofer, and anything I didn't understand, I would ask him. And sometimes guys would complain, why am I asking so many questions? But after a few weeks, I tried again learning Leshem, and I all of a sudden realized I could not believe it. I'm reading Leshem and I understand every word, almost every word. Because he explains so clearly, even Kabbalah, he puts it into the mouth. He explains very, very clearly what he's saying. It's the clearest you could possibly imagine. All I was missing was just the basic halachic term, Kabbalistic terms of what things mean, what things are. Just the beginning of the build-up of the Seder Ishtalshalut, how Hashem created the world, from the highest of high till all the way down here, our earth, how it all came about. So this got me realize that this is what I was all my life wishing for. This is what I was waiting for. This eventually quenched my thirst of my curiosity. Nowadays, curiosity can lead people to such terrible directions. The whole generation today is following internet, and people are getting addicted to computers nowadays, all because of this strong curiosity which is going out of boundaries completely. I'm saying, instead of not quenching the thirst of curiosity, any person that's 20 years old and married, speak to his rabbi, get permission from his rabbi, and get started. There's no reason why a person should just follow all kinds of myths about it. Any person that has a desire for it, go ahead. Ask your rabbi if you could start, and get started. Obviously, slowly. Don't jump straight into the deep end. Take it slowly. But this is nothing like family tree, nothing like even dealing into the depth of the nigle parts of Torah, of understanding the depth of the mitzvot. This is something which is, you can't describe it. It's something so sweet, so great, so uplifting. It's something really special. And it's a very big pity that many people, because of all kinds of stigmat, all kinds of myths, that many of them are not correct, are losing so much good, so much depth in life, that gets the whole keeping mitzvot so much deeper, so much more special. The whole tefillah becomes more special once a person learns the parts of Kabbalah to do with tefillah, with prayer. So I learned within the last 4.5 years that I've been learning by Rav Reuven Sofer, I learned twice through the Otzrot Chaim, which is the most complete book of the Ari Kadosh that describes the whole Seder Ishtalshelut from all the way up, from the Ein Sof to all the way down to our world, to the Olam Hazeh, our earth. And first time I learned by Rav Sofer, it took a few years, and he really learned it like he learned in the same yeshiva where I learned when I was young. He learned in Kol Torah. He also learned by Rav Shlomo Hagaon Hagadol Maran, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he really has this, he learned through the ways of Talmud Bavli to the depth, Ha'olchim B'choshech, Or Gadol, which is very important. A person working on learning Talmud Bavli really gets a person more on the ground that he really could afterwards digest better the Kabbalah with his feet on the ground without using imagination too much. In fact, the very important point I wanted to share with you, Rav Reuven Sofer said in one of his shiurim that his friend went into Maran HaGaon Harav Elyashiv Zecher Tzadik Livracha and asked him, he was a student learning in a koilel, full day, and he asked Rav Elyashiv, could I learn Kabbalah every day afternoon? Seder Sheni, second part of the day. Rav Elyashiv said, yes. So he said to him, but I haven't yet fulfilled my stomach with the whole of Talmud Bavli and all the halacha, all the poskim. Lo mileti kresi b'shasu poskim. That's a term used. I'm not ready for it. So Rav Elyashiv said to him, nowadays, if we will wait until we fill up our stomach with shas and poskim, we will never learn Kabbalah. No one will ever learn Kabbalah. So nowadays, any person that's obviously, he didn't have to say, obviously over 20 and married, but any person that's seriously learning Talmud Bavli, that really has a desire for learning Kabbalah, should go ahead and learn it. So he said, it's excellent. Learn it second part of the day, learn Kabbalah. Obviously, he must continue all the time, learning also Talmud Bavli. Not learn Kabbalah full day, definitely not. This shiur of Sofer is only morning. But this is something that a person should not hesitate and really go for it. In fact, I'll end off with the words of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. But before I bring his words, I just want to mention which books are main Kabbalistic books I learned through in the last few years. I learned after learning through the whole Otzrot Chaim with Rav Sofer, very in depth. He brings all the different explanations and asks questions and contradictions and really explained it in a beautiful way. After that, I learned through it again myself with the explanation of Rav Gamliel Rabinovich. Tiva Otzrot, it's called. That he explains every verse, what is said in that verse. He doesn't explain every word, but every verse he explains what's said here and makes things very, very easy to understand for beginners. Very recommended. Tiv HaOtzrot of Rav Gamliel Rabinovich. Besides, I got through so far, besides all the paging through I've been doing all the years in Leshem, I got through from beginning to end the book of the part of the Leshem called Akdamot V'She'arim. And there's a very big misconception about this. People think that this book is the book the Leshem intended for beginners. Maybe because it's called Hakdamot, preface. But I think that the Leshem, after writing all 4 books of the Leshem, his intention today is that should not be the first book to start off with. Because reading through that book, from beginning to end, one goes through from the easy to difficult. There's all of a sudden very difficult pieces that's impossible to understand for beginners. and especially the end, there's a last part called Shara Apone Kadim, which is speaking about the highest parts of Kabbalah. Definitely not suitable for beginners. So what I personally did is I heard a rule in Kabbalah. And whenever you don't understand something, don't give up and don't skip. Anything you don't understand, read through it quickly, because reading through it gives you in your mind the terms. And once you get used to the terms, later on when you'll hear about it, things will sit right with you and you'll start understanding much more. So it's not for nothing. Anything in Kabbalah you don't understand, just continue reading. Read on. Besides the point that we know that the Chida, one of the great Kabbalists, says that reading Zohar HaKadosh is worth it even for a person who doesn't know anything. Just reading through it without understanding is good for the soul. The words are very, very holy words. That's good for the soul. In fact, the Uriel HaKadosh recommended to people that did tremendous sins, that asked him how to repent from their sins. He told them, learn every day 5 pages in the Zohar HaKadosh. Even if you don't understand anything, and you shouldn't really, in that stage in your life, once a person is not ready for it yet, sit and try and understand it yet. But read through it. Just the reading through it is good for the soul. It purifies the soul. So I realized that that's not the book to start off with. Which book of the Leshem is the best book starting off with? After I learned this, I learned through the Sefer HaDe'ah, second volume, HaDe'ah Chelek Bet, which has a lot of Agadah, as I said. Very, very enjoyable, very pleasant. Mainly, big parts of it are Nigle, are not Kabbalah. But that's just to get used to the Leshem's style. But the book that's really worth starting off with is Sefer Biurim. Biurim is an explanation of the Leshem on the Etz Chaim of the Uriel HaKadosh. Now, in the Etz Chaim is a book called Otzrot Chaim. A person should not learn this according to the Otzrot Chaim, which is a book for beginners of Kabbalah. A person should learn this with the full Etz Chaim, because the Leshem is built, Biurim is built on the full book of Etz Chaim, which includes a few books. Each chapter has a part taken from Otzrot Chaim, a part taken from Kilot Yaakov, a part taken from Adam Yashar, from other places in the Uriel HaKadosh. It's taken from a few books put together. But a person must learn, for understanding this Leshem HaBiurim, he must learn the Sefer Etz Chaim in the order, the beginning, slowly, read through a paragraph in Etz Chaim, and then read through the same paragraph with the Leshem Sefer HaBiurim, because that book is so perfect how he gives a person slowly a taste of what Kabbalah is about. He gives Yesodot, he gives rules about Kabbalah. And that is, I think, very recommended, especially for a yeshiva student who is accustomed to the learning of Nigle, learning Talmud Bavli in the yeshivot, and he has all kinds of myths about Kabbalah. This knocks away many of the myths and explains what Kabbalah really is. And this is written by a person who was a very, very great in Nigle as well. The Leshem was one of the Gdolei Ador, not only in one of the greatest sages in his time, not only in Nistar, in Kabbalah, but also in Nigle. In fact, the great sage, great Kabbalist of our times, the Rav Shraida Beletsky, they asked him once, who was the greatest sage from the times of the Gaon Vilna, 200 years ago, till our times? Who was the greatest sage? So he said, the Leshem. They said to him, the Leshem? How about the Chafetz Chaim? How about Rabbi Akiva Eger, the Rav Chaim Volozhin, the Chazon Ish, many other great sages? I'm sure I skipped very important ones. How about all the other sages? He said, yes, they were very, very extremely great. But if we look at the greatness of the great rabbis, great sages in Nigle, in the Talmudic part of the Torah, and in the Nistar, in the Kabbalistic part of the Torah, together, the way we see things, said the Rav Shraida Beletsky, the greatest rabbi was, ever since the Gaon of Vilna, was the Leshem. So we're speaking about really, really greatness. And the last book the Leshem wrote was Sefer HaKlalim, which is real deep Kabbalah. And that the Leshem said, if only one person will benefit from this book, it's worth it, because it's such beautiful secrets he has in there that it's worth working all the effort he worked. If even one person will get to the level of being able to learn the Sefer HaKlalim of the Leshem. Later on, I learned through other books of Kabbalah, and Rav Sofer is very heavily involved in the Rashash. So I'm definitely not locked only onto the Leshem, definitely not. But for beginners, for a start, I think especially for Lithuanian yeshiva students, Leshem is the best way to start. And I wanted to mention one more thing before saying Rav Chaim Kanievsky. How did I actually change my stigma, my image? I said that in my mind, the greatest rabbi I wanted to be like was in the previous generation was the Chafetz Chaim. How did I all of a sudden get onto the Leshem? What made me start learning Leshem? What happened was, I read a story, two stories about the Chafetz Chaim. The one story was that the Chafetz Chaim once was very old. He came to visit the Leshem in a different town, and the Leshem was not well. He was lying in bed. The room was dark. The Chafetz Chaim came into the room, bent down on his knees, and whispered in the dark with the Leshem for half an hour. He came out of the room, and he was shivering. The Chafetz Chaim was shivering from head to toe. And he told his students, in this world, we can get close to the Leshem. In the world to come, we won't be able to see the Leshem even from far. So if the Chafetz Chaim thinks so highly of the Leshem, that made a big impression on me. The other story was, the Chafetz Chaim once sent his student, Rabbi Eliyahu Dushnitzer, who was a very great secret tzaddik, secret sage. And he told him, when you go past the town of the Leshem, don't forget to go into the Leshem and speak to the Leshem. He told him, the greatest rabbis, what they do is, every action they do in this world, they do it in correspondence with the world, with the spiritual worlds above. So they learn Kabbalah, and they know about the high spiritual worlds all the way up, and they do every single thing to be corresponding to the spiritual high worlds. But the Leshem is so great in Kabbalah that he doesn't have to build in this world corresponding to the upper worlds. He builds straight in the upper worlds. He builds over there. And from there comes pouring down all the shefa, all the greatness in the result of the Leshem's powers, of his Kabbalah. So these two stories made my change in thinking, and my new image is life. Besides the Chafetz Chaim, I read many of his books. That caused me to read a lot of the books of the Leshem. Although a person should not stay only with Leshem. A person should know that as great as the Leshem was, but the Rashash was much greater. The Uriel was much greater. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was much greater. There's always different levels. So we know that the Leshem was Zocher to Gilui Eliyahu. He was Zocher to see Eliyahu Hanavi. Rabbi Yashiv witnessed that. He had Ruach HaKodesh. He could see spiritual things, supernatural sight he had. But nevertheless, the Rashash, the Uriel Kadosh, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they learned the full Torah of Kabbalah by Eliyahu Hanavi, by the prophet Eliyahu. we speak on a totally different level. So I'm saying, use the Leshem for the beginning, to get involved, to get interested, to see the beauty. But afterwards, don't stop with the Leshem. Go on. Learn the works of the Ariya Kadosh. Learn the Rashash. So I hope in the next Shurim we'll slowly get into these learnings. First with the Hakdama, slowly. And I would like to end with the words of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, one of the great sages of our time. Maran HaGaon Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, I went to him a few months ago and I asked him, the Zohar HaKadosh says, written 2,000 years ago by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the deepest secrets of a Torah, the Zohar HaKadosh says, begin Hai Sifra, in the merit of learning this book, Yipkun min Galuta berachame. The Jewish people will exit the Galut with mercy. They will finish the Galut without having to go through such a difficult time, with mercy of Hashem, of God. So I asked him, does that mean only by learning Zohar HaKadosh? Or if a person wants to learn Ariya Kadosh, which explains the depth of the wisdom of the Zohar HaKadosh, or he wants to learn Leshem, which explains the depth of the Ariya Kadosh, is that also counted as bringing Mashiach closer? So Rav Chaim Kanievsky said, you should learn both together. You should learn also Zohar HaKadosh and also Ariya Kadosh and Leshem. So I hope you all have a very good day and you all get this desire to want to one day achieve the level of being great, not only in the Nigle parts of Torah, but also reach one day the depth of Kabbalah. And B'derech Shadam Rotze Lelech, when a person really wants something, Molichin Oto. Hashem leads in that way. May we all merit in this merit to see soon the coming of Mashiach Tzidkeinu, B'mira B'yameinu. Amen. Have a good day.